On today's episode, we learn that denying abortion means women have less rights than a corpse, that working is optional, that homeschooling ruins child innocence, that the Supreme Court returning power to the states is actually an act of authoritarianism, and finally, we'll take a look at Woodrow Wilson's mature and responsible foreign policy. This is Cringe Post. Hey friends, welcome to this episode of the Cringe Post podcast. This is the podcast where we gather the cringiest political and cultural takes that we see on our feeds each week, and we break down where they went wrong, point out some of the underlying assumptions, try to have a little bit of a laugh along the way. My name's Britt, and I'm here with my co-host Donnie. And if you're watching this or you're listening to this, please make sure to like, share, and subscribe. It really helps us out and helps us, get our message out there. Also, if you're listening to this show and you want to see some of these memes and some of these posts, we have a visual show companion to the show that you can check out at cringepost.com. Just click the link there. Before we get into looking at other people's cringe takes, we always like to reflect on our past and things that we might have said or memories that we might have had that of things that we did that might not have been the best or may have been a little bit cringy, just to show that, hey, we're good sports about all this stuff. And so today we're looking at a past event in Donnie's time at school when were you president or vice president? I can't remember.
I was vice president, yeah.
Vice president at our university. So Donnie and I we met each other at university. So Donnie in 2014 tweeted out, quote, "We don't need capitalism, we don't need socialism, we need Jesusism," unquote. And then he remarks, "Is that a kind of theocracy? Because I'm pretty sure that'll fail too." So give us some background on this take.
Yeah, so this is not my, the first quote there is not my words. It was a phrase spoken at the chapel service because the university we went to was a private university. It was Assemblies of God. I don't know that you have a background in that. My family... My grandpa was an Assemblies of God pastor, and I had uncles who went there, but I myself am not Assemblies of God. And the style of chapel there is not exactly to my particular liking. And I think the chapel was even more, if you're, sort of in the church, almost more Foursquare than it is Assemblies of God, at least traditional Assemblies of God, that sort of stylistic. Anyway, so the speaker makes this remark, and at the core essence of it, I don't disagree in that I don't think ultimately a government system can save a person. And I think that's kind of his point. But I was so tired of these glib little remarks that are these bumper sticker slogan type things to say that really don't explain anything in nuance. And he says, we don't need capitalism, we don't need socialism, we need Jesusism. And all of this being in the context of, a political thing, I think his point would have been much better if he had said, ultimately, a political solution will not save you, will not be your salvation, will not save the world. Because to me, it's, and I explained in this tweet thread further on, but that, you still have to live in the real world, even if you are a believer in Christ and believe that he's the ultimate one in control and transforms. You do have to work within the limits of reality, and I think in doing so, you obviously want to advocate for certain systems and protest against others. Otherwise, you'd have to say, well, I don't believe we're in this world, therefore I shouldn't have any opinions on the institution of slavery, which I think is a silly idea, right? So it was just a really cringe moment for me, and the sweet taste on top of all this, because I was vice president. Later, I was talking with some of the people in the school administration, and they actually said, we had a student complaining about this tweet and how sharp and critical you were. I was like, what? Because I was in school leadership, apparently I'm not allowed to express the fact that a speaker might say something that I disagreed with or thought was cheesy or incomplete of a thought, which I think is a really funny thing. And as much as our university is better against some of the other schools in terms of wokeism, it has been the university institutions just slide that way, and I think that was kind of a little leak in the dam, as it were.
Did you have to delete it?
I did not. I think they wanted me to, but I didn't. They didn't force me to, but they were saying they didn't want me tweeting more things like that.
Dad, did you stop tweeting things like that?
I
can't remember.
I think I did, but I think I was more I think I still said things I wanted to say, but I tried to be a little bit less abrasive. Maybe that was sort of my, all right, I'll work with you here. I'll say
political leadership at the school.
I know. I will have to be a Kamala Harris. I have to be an inspiring vice president.
Yes. Oh, well, I think we can move on from this one. But yeah, that I guess that's not as much like self cringe as it is just a memory of a cringy time.
Yeah, it was just a cringy phrase and a cringy situation, and we've been dealing with cringe for a long time.
We have been. All right, moving on to the first of our cringe posts that we saw in our feeds this week. We've got a person that writes on a Facebook post or Facebook comment, "Here's the thing, guys. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter when life begins. It doesn't matter whether a fetus is a human being or not. That entire argument is a red herring, a distraction, a subjective and unwinnable argument that could not matter less. It doesn't matter whether we're talking about a fertilized egg or a fetus or a baby or a 5-year-old or a Nobel Prize winning pediatric oncologist. Nobody has the right to use your body against your will, even to save their life or the life of another person. That's it. That's the argument. You cannot be forced to donate blood or marrow or organs, even though thousands die every year on waiting lists. They cannot even harvest your organs after your death without your explicit written pre-mortem permission. Denying women the right to abortion means we have less bodily autonomy than a corpse." And man, this one, I saw this and it kind of shook me, honestly, to the core, because this is they make fun of people for saying that, like, oh, if you legalize abortion, you're going to have infanticide. But this is the argument for infanticide, right? Because basically what this person is saying is like, hey, I brought something into this world, right? Like I made a choice that carries a result or a consequence, and that consequence carries a responsibility of living under that consequence, right? Like the time to control your body and not have a pregnancy is before you're pregnant, right? There's tons of contraception. There's tons of ways to avoid becoming pregnant. The time to do that is before. Once you are pregnant, you have brought a being into existence that now you owe a responsibility to make sure that it's alive and well. And these people will, debate whether it's actually a life or not. I would posit that the only reason you want to abort an unborn baby is because it is a human being, right? Because if it wasn't a human being, and if it wasn't going to grow up into being a human being, like most of the reasons that they say, like, hey, we want to abort is because it's going to drain resources later, it's going to be undue hardship on the mother later. But that point aside, this person totally says it doesn't matter. It could be a human baby for all we care, because it drains my resources, and if I don't want to give those resources to it, then I should be able to kill it. Well, it's like, now extend that to a baby that's 10 months old, right? A baby that's 10 months old that is breastfeeding. They rely on the bodily functions and fluids from a mother for its nutrients. If it doesn't get that, short of someone else feeding the baby, it's going to die. Someone has to bear that responsibility. So this person, according to them, up until the point that you can feed yourself, basically, like, you are allowed to be killed and destroyed or abandoned on the side of the road to die. And I think that's a really terrifying, I mean, they say that it's an unwinnable argument to say that life matters. It's like, yeah, you're right. Like, you lose. Your argument loses because life does matter. We all know inherently that you shouldn't kill an infant. I think even the worst kind of person can acknowledge that there's morality surrounding that. And to argue on that side of it, it's like, it's just crazy. It's weird to me that they would posit this in such a way to, like, push it all the way to the side. It's like they are totally neglecting responsibility, and that's what's at the core of abortion is, right? It's a neglect of personal responsibility and the consequence that you have willingly taken on. You have the freedom to not accept responsibility, right? Like, that's what freedom actually means, is like, I can choose what responsibilities I have or I don't have. And if I sometimes don't choose to have a responsibility, I reap the consequence of not having it as well as the consequence of having it. If I choose not to work, I'm not going to eat. If I choose to have unprotected sex and not take the precautions to, not get pregnant, then there's a chance I'm going to get pregnant. And because I got pregnant, I now owe a responsibility to that. You can't just choose when that responsibility ends.
And I think that responsibility that you mentioned, it occurs regardless of the amount of consent given in a situation, because the easy clapback for all of them is to say, the cases of an unwitting pregnancy, like rape, right? And so, again, as we pretty much every pro-life person will say, okay, well, to start, if that's where you're going, then let's make the policy based on the rule, not the exceptions to the rule, because rape and other sort of forced pregnancies are the vast minority. So, assuming that this is your line of logic, and it has to do with responsibility being born and using your body against your will and all these sorts of things. Let's narrow out every case of abortions of convenience. Let's get rid of all of those, because your argument, if you jump to the rape line here, does not apply. And but even still, I think from both a secular and a spiritual standpoint, there is something intrinsically different about your obligation to a biological offspring of your own versus any other human in the world. And for them to make this claim that no one can use your body against you, I think, for instance, if you've ever heard of the example of the violinist, I don't know why it's a violinist, but it's this sort of thought experiment they'll play that kind of uses this type of logic, where it's you've been kidnapped in the middle of the night, you wake up and you've been grafted to this world-class violinist, and it's because this violinist is world-class, but he's gonna die unless your specific body is grafted to him for 9 months, and then you'll be free again. But for those 9 months, the only way he will live is doing this, and they argue that you still don't have this right. But even in that case, that scenario relies upon, one, you being taken there against your will, so that, again, precludes all of the former exceptions we're talking about, so no abortions of convenience. Secondarily, it talks about someone as though to a stranger, and as though that person had consent in the matter and chose. But the problem is that, one, your own baby is, again, biologically related to you in a unique relationship that the only two people in the world have with this new individual life is the father and the mother. And you and I would argue similarly that a father, even if he's a rapist, has an obligation. Now, whether or not he's going to do it, and whether or not, civil law is going to recognize that in a way that is beneficial to the family is another matter. But intrinsically, there is a unique relationship between this life and its parents, because there is no other two people on this planet that have that relationship. So to deny this link from either a natural perspective or a spiritual one, I don't think you need to be theistic to see that unique relationship. I think you have to be on an entirely different level of denial to think that you bear no responsibility for bringing this into the world. And even still, I still will always bring up the idea of reciprocal ethics, where no one has the right to your body, but you similarly have no right to its body, and unless it has done something in a way that is voluntarily and maliciously impeding upon you, your person, and your property, well, then you any action you take is killing another innocent victim. And so if you, the former person here, have been victimized, I don't think that justifies victimizing another innocent person, because you as an innocent person had a greater harm done to you by someone taking advantage of you in a weakened state. Does not mean that you get to take advantage of an innocent person in a weaker state just because you have also been a victim. The funny thing is, many of the people, not everyone, but many of the people who hold this position, and where you got this particular post, I'm probably about 90% sure this particular individual would hold these positions. But a lot of these people hold the positions similarly, that one, healthcare is a right, which requires your own body being used for someone else's gain. If you're a doctor, or if you're there has to be some level of force used against someone else to their body performing certain things, which is interesting. And secondarily, they also don't believe in punitive justice, which would say that, the victims get to punish the criminal that has done them wrong by execution or whatever. A lot of these people would say that no, justice needs to be rehabilitative, which I tend to agree with. But you can't simultaneously say that a justice system is only just if it's not punitive, and then have a punitive system against an innocent life, just because you have also been a victim of a tragedy.
That's a really interesting point, because you're exactly right where I got this from. We both know this person, and they definitely, I mean, they just tweeted out about universal health care, right? And that's kind of a lot of the proponents of these people go from at the standpoint like, oh, this is about women's health, right? Like we need to guarantee reproductive rights and women's health rights and care. And they'll make the same argument. It's like, do you realize like a positive right requires that you take something from someone else at no cost or at no compensation for it at the very like at its base level, right? Because if you're going to guarantee that someone can get some sort of care or some sort of item or some sort of product or service, to guarantee that means that you will force someone to do it without any compensation, which in effect is basically slavery, right? That's what slavery is when you do something against your will for no compensation. And but that's the problem, right? Like with, I mean, a lot with the left is there's no truth but power, right? It's whatever type of policies or whatever type of perspective or framework makes it so that they can come into power and they can leverage it against you and bend the world to their will is the one that they choose. And we see that in everything from the minimum wage to healthcare to, I mean, unfortunately, this stuff, which is basically advocating for infanticide, which is really terrifying. Like it still kind of makes me sick to my stomach when I read it.
Yeah, and the last thing I'll add here is that it's difficult to have a rational conversation about this because getting to the point where you're saying something like, in order for universal healthcare to be applied, you have to approve of some kind of slavery. It seems like hyperbole, and it seems like they'll just sort of laugh you out of the room. Because not a lot of people are willing to go step by step and have that conversation and then point out where the logic drops. And that's the thing is I've had this conversation with people and they'll oh, you're just being ridiculous. And I'll walk step by step and they'll deny the end claim, but they cannot refute any of the steps that lead up to there. You can take them through the sort of the Socratic method and they won't be able to stop you, but they will still deny the end claim because it's a very emotional thing.
It's the SpongeBob Patrick meme when he's with, I can't remember.
With the wallet. Yeah, exactly. Yep. Yeah. So it's tough. I mean, I even remember early when Rand Paul was in the Senate, like when he'd first been elected, and he made this kind of claim because they were talking about healthcare. And I remember people were just like, wow, this is ridiculous and dunked on you. And none of them could refute why. And the funny thing is, a lot of them were talking about the Hippocratic Oath. And as far as I'm aware, the Hippocratic Oath is given voluntarily. So if you as a doctor are willing to do that, that's great. But that's a system of voluntarism and free marketeer, not a system that nationalizes, requires, and forces service to be given in a specific manner.
Yep, and kind of on that same thread, we've got two posts here about work. The first one is from a person with their tag name is unashamed abortion haver. And she tweets out, in order for capitalism to work, you need a permanent underclass of people who work crappy jobs for no or little pay and live shorter, crappier lives, and you need them to pop out babies you force them to create and birth, trapped in the same circumstance, like slavery. And then the second person writes out, and I thought these were related. This person writes out, I want a soft life. I want ease. I want relaxation. I do not want to hustle. I do not want to grind. Grinding wears you down to brittle nothingness. I do not want to work my life away. I want enjoyment and rest, not as rewards, but as practice. My life will be a practice in joy. So, oh my goodness. Okay, so the first one, it's almost like a Mad Lib, which is like, okay, I've got these different things, and we've got abortion and women's rights, and we've got capitalism and slavery, and okay, fill in the blanks, and connect them all together. And that's what the first person did. If you think about, they get all the elements right? Like they've got all the aspects of it, but the fact is that reality dictates that there are a lot of crappy jobs that need to be done, right? Like you need to make food, you need to make sure that you're warm and have shelter, and you need to make sure that you've got water. And for basically all of history, it's taken a lot of effort and a lot of crappy jobs to make that possible just for one person to exist. The beauty of capitalism is that now it's way easier to make all that stuff happen, right? Now you don't now people can basically subsist on 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. And there's enough food. Society's able to make enough food for everyone to be able to more or less eat, as long as they're contributing, to the greater cause. Some of them, of which it even allows for people that don't contribute in an effective way to be able to eat, which is amazing, right? Like, there's enough buffer room that people can do things that don't actually produce any food or don't actually have any results from them, just to try it out and innovate, that there's enough surplus from everyone else that's working in something that is effective for them to be able to do that. And so they totally get it wrong, right? Like, we live longer, better lives than anyone has ever lived ever in history. Like, if you want to be born anywhere and at any place in time, you want to be born in the United States of America in the 21st century, because even if you're super, super poor, you can spend, about $3 to $5 and you could get your whole days of calories from a Big Mac at McDonald's. Like, that is an amazing thing. It's not the best source of calories, but it sure beats starving to death. And then the other person, I think this relates to it, because they're talking about, like, oh, you got to work, it's like slavery. It's like, if you want to have a life of rest and enjoyment, but you don't want to work to make food or, like, make the things that provide for that enjoyment, who's going to do it? Like, someone has to do that for you to be that way. That means you're advocating for, like we were talking about earlier, for someone to be enslaved to provide for you.
Yeah, that first one is really great, because, when I think about classism and I think about a forced class of people who can't raise their circumstances and who don't increase their standard of living, I definitely think of America, the land of opportunity, which was its whole moniker and the whole ability. I mean, think about this fact. Think about the fact that even as we ended the institution of slavery, which slavery was horrible and awful, and Jim Crow laws and government regulations still tried to force down black populations, think about the fact that we now have a society where we have, people whose like grandparents were literal slaves, living free in positions of power and business, and even in politics and all these kinds of things. And to think that this system of capitalism is what's kept them down in slavery and not enabled them to rise above that class, to come from literal slavery into places of position and prominence. You have to be very willfully ignorant. The places where there's one class that keeps doing the same thing over and over, those are the strata where the government dictates what you do and how you do it. To create a class that works crappier jobs for little or no pay, that's filled in with the people who don't want they want the life of ease. They want the soft life. They don't want to grind. They don't want to put in that work ethic. And if that's the case, if you don't want to better yourself and you don't want to put out more value, then you are going to stay in the same class from start to finish. But the normal trajectory of human work generally is that you start out not very skilled and not very talented, and so you work for an amount that's not very much because you're not producing very much, and then you learn, and then you produce more, and then you get more, and so you get that the cycle of when you're in your 20s, you're making less money than when you're in your 50s. The only reason, well, not the only reason, but the vast majority of reasons why that doesn't happen is when people don't want to improve and they don't want to produce more and they don't want to put in that work ethic. Now, is that my call to make? No, I think if you want that soft life and you want that relaxation and you're willing to trade off what that means, then that's great. That's your choice, and you can stay in an easier job and just have less material things. And for many people, that's perfectly fine. I mean, think about monks and the kinds of people who live ascetic lives in the wilderness who have very few things but are totally fulfilled. That's great. That's great for you. But these people want to these two posters simultaneously sort of laud this idea of not working, but then also saying, and it's totally unfair that when you don't want to work, you're trapped in your circumstances and you don't rise above it. Which, again, free markets and free market exchange is the opposite. It lets you stay there, or it lets you rise to prominence if you want to do it. It's all based on what you can provide and what other people are willing to pay for it. That's the only thing that keeps you up or down.
And I guess if we were to like steel man these folks' arguments, right? Like, I think the most compelling people in this camp will say things like, well, like, no, I have no problem working hard, but like working hard gets you now less than it did for our parents' generation, you know, in the 1970s before we were taking off the gold standard. And so it's like, yeah, you're right. Like, you have to work, your dollar goes not as far. In order to buy a 2,000 square foot house here in the Seattle area, you've got to have $1.2 million to do that. And that sounds crazy, and it's very difficult and very hard. The solution to it is not doing more of what got us here in the first place, right? And that's what I find so funny about that argument, because it is compelling, right? It's like, we are worse off. Our generation is worse off because of the baby boomers and all those folks borrowing money on our, you know, with us footing the bill at the end of the day. And now we're paying the cost for it. And they're not wrong about that. But the solution is not for us to continue doing what the baby boomers did, right? It's not going to make anything better. And kind of to your point about like, and I had a philosophy class with one of our professors. I think you and I both took from him. But he had this kind of like math equation for like happiness, which is like, happiness is your level of desire in life, you know, next to your level of power to, you know, accomplish that desire. And so he's like, one philosophy is just lower your desire to the point where if you know, basically you don't need any power to be happy, right? To accomplish or get those desires. And we have a friend from school, like, I remember him telling me, like, you know, I got paid to go to college, you know, I had a full ride and all this stuff, but like, I'm okay working at 7-Eleven, eating pizza every night, and playing video games basically till the day I die. And he does that today. And it's like, good for him. But if he came out and he's like, hey, why don't I have a Lamborghini? Or why don't I own a house? Or if he gets sick and he can't afford good health care, it's like, dude, that's the consequence of your choices. Like, you don't get to go back and like retroactively decide that you want to reap all the benefits of responsibility. That's just not how reality works. And that's kind of like the underlying issue with people on the left economically, is just a denial of reality.
I think about this in terms of relationships with other people too, because I think it becomes a little bit more clear when you recognize that markets and capitalism and all this is a balance and a measure and a, you know, ecosystem of people, of real life humans. And so you can take these principles and boil them down to the individual level and think about it sort of in the sense of, you know, I don't want I want a soft life. I want ease. I want relaxation. I don't want to work to put in, you know, like, let's just look at the relationship of marriage. It's like, I don't want to have to work and take out the garbage and take care of my wife when she's sick and go pick up groceries when she's not feeling well or just doesn't feel like it, or earn enough so that we're both taken care of and not just me. All these kinds of things. I just want to have fun times where I can watch movies on the couch with my wife, and I want her to love me, and I don't want to have to put any effort. And everyone would recognize how ridiculous that is, because that's not a two-way street. It's not how relationships with other humans work. And reality is much the same in terms of material wealth and markets, where you're interacting with other people, and they're not going to give you something for nothing unless they happen to be generous and charitable. But that's just not the reality of everyone's experience.
It's interesting. I just like to continue talking about it, because I'm thinking about some other stuff with it too. Like, it's interesting that the folks that are, you find it's commonly held that the people that are advocating for these type of like reality denying economic policies also have and hold views of like, you're beautiful no matter what you do, and you are valuable no matter what you do, and it's okay if you take a bunch of L's, like you're valuable no matter what. And there's a little bit of truth to that, right? Like, a person is intrinsically valuable no matter what, right? Because it's a human life. Not according to the first poster, obviously. But it's almost like there are consequences for the actions or inaction that you didn't take. And I was just thinking about, like, I'm a UFC fan, right? And like Conor McGregor, like, did it all, made a bunch of money. Yeah, I think he's worth like $500 million now. Can basically do anything he wants, but for some reason he still wants to chase the UFC lightweight title, right? Like, he still wants to earn that again. Like, he's had it before, but he wants to be the reigning champion again. And that's not something you can buy, right? Like, the only way you get to it is if you do the work and you actually win, right? And what I see a lot of people doing is they want the championship, they want the title, they want the feeling of accomplishment, but they don't understand that like the only thing that makes it worthwhile to have that or makes it feel good to have those things is if all the suffering and work happened before you got there. Without it, it's meaningless, right? Like in the true sense of the word, because what makes it special is the amount of work that it took to get there.
Absolutely.
All right, moving on to our next one. We've got our good old friend Keith Olbermann, otherwise known as Angry Old White Man. Angry old white journalist man that cries about Joe Rogan. And he tweeted out, imagine putting, quote, homeschool mom, unquote, in your bio and not understanding you've just ruined the lives of 5 innocent children. Man, I guess I'm the exception to the rule then, man, because my 2 brothers and I, we were all homeschooled, and I think we turned out okay. According to Larry Sharp, last week, he wasn't so sure, but he's a funny guy. If you guys haven't listened to that episode yet, it's a really good one. It's one of the things that really struck me about this, because this is all on the aspect of like, hey, teachers, stuff is coming out about what teachers are actually teaching kids in school. Lots of ugly, gross stuff that even if you like read it in like over the air, or if you read it in a parent teacher conference, like they'd kick you out because it's so vulgar what they're teaching them. And I like that he uses the word innocent children. And it's like, dude, sending a child to public school is kind of like the best way to make sure that they don't stay innocent, right? Like their innocence is removed from them and they are perverted, and they are the things that children should not experience occur at public school. I think we brought this statistic up before, but according to the Department of Education, 10% of students will incur some sort of sexual assault or sexual abuse from a public school administrator or teacher during their time at public school. That's 5. If we're keeping with like the numbers, that's 5 million kids per year. And that's, when you contrast that with the Catholic Church, which was 300,000 kids, which is still awful, but between 1970 and 2010, I mean, it dwarfs that, right? So just the fact that you could think that like children are innocent and a pure innocent soul being sent to public school is the best way to preserve that is just, instead of the parent who birthed them and raised them and cares about where they end up, is a ridiculous premise.
I almost wanted to include this one just for the awareness that it brings, that these people are monsters. They hate you. They hate that you control your family. They want to control your children, and the fact that you get a say. Think about this. Think about the fact that the basic idea that parents are responsible for teaching their children morals and things outside of school, that's been even for pro-public school types, an uncontested reality for ever since public school was founded. It was sort of like, send them to a public school so they can learn arithmetic and math. And then it crept into sort of social issues, learn how to deal with racism and those sorts of things. And now it's gotten to the point where they're straight up admitting that they hate that you have any control over your kids and that you get to teach them. Because let's be honest, he's not upset that you are teaching your kids how to do math. He's not upset that you're teaching your kids how to read. He's upset that you're instilling values into them, and that's something that the schools should be doing from his point of view. So that's, and that has never been the real contention. It kind of has by the masterminds, but by the general population who's either neutral or indifferent on public school or pro-public school, just sort of vaguely, they've never thought that public school should be the only place where kids are learning their morals. So this really gives away the game that he hates the idea because you are ruining lives of the children because you are influencing and exerting control over how they're being raised and what kind of morals and values they're being brought up with. It's frankly kind of refreshing in the sense that finally someone isn't pretending to be what they aren't. He's really in many ways sort of taken the mask off and said, all right, this is what I actually think. And so in that sense, good for him, I suppose. I hope that this wakes more people up and more parents up to see, oh, this is not a matter of, public or homeschooling might be nice, but it's really a matter of it's kind of it's your option right now. It is the only option, and I don't know. There's not a ton of depth here other than they've just given up the game, and they are monsters. And the idea more and more that you can have a balanced government public school should be an idea that dies out.
Totally agree with you on that as a fellow homeschooler.
Yeah.
All right. For our next cringe post, we've got Mayor Laurie Lightfoot, and she tweets out, "To my friends in the LGBTQ plus community, the Supreme Court is coming for us next. This moment has to be a call to arms. We will not surrender our rights without a fight to victory." First off, I just can't. Politicians like that think that this is like the right like cadence and tone to use like this. It's just so like, it's cheesy, man. Like it's a really cheesy way to, we know what you're doing. You're trying to be, it's like when a politician says, look, the problem is, and it's like, I know that you were literally coached to say it that way, you know, very much like the Marco Rubio and Chris Christie example you bring up all the time. It's like Marco Rubio had some consultant that said, hey, you know, we know exactly what Obama is doing. Let's not pretend. Like he's like, use that line and use it a bunch. It's a winning line. And it just reinforces the fact these people are cardboard cutouts, like that just want power and to occupy it no matter what the cost. The thing about this, you know, like substantively, like what I don't like is this Democrat opinion that like because the Supreme Court is overturning another Supreme Court ruling which exercised more authority than it was supposed to is evidence of the Supreme Court overreaching. Like it's just a really weird thing. It's like, hey, like you want people to be able to decide about whether they get an abortion, to have that control. That's what the Supreme Court just did by overturning Roe v. Wade. They said, hey, you know, a bunch of 9 judges in Washington, D.C. should not decide what everyone else gets to do. We're giving you back the power and the ability to choose what you're going to do as a state. And for them to be able to treat it like it's some great overreach, some dictator. It's like, when does a dictator relinquish the power or relinquish a precedent that gives them more power? It's not how it works.
Yeah, it's funny that this highlights sort of the conservative and liberal problem that we have, where they see, look, the other team is now in control, you know, whether or not you actually think that the Supreme Court is now extremely biased or it wasn't ever, whatever your perspective there is. Outcome that I don't like is now, you know, from their perspective, imposed on the entire nation, even though, as you highlighted, it's really the removal of that kind of imposition. But, you know, so now we just need to fight and take over the arms of control again. And so, you know, oh man, it's terrible. The Nazis rose to power and are they're taking Jews away. All we need to do is take over these authoritarian powers and we'll use them for good. It's all it is, you know. Sometimes you have to recognize that the institution itself is maybe set up in such a way that it is dysfunctional. People are worried about the politicization of the Supreme Court as if it was ever this apolitical identity where, you know, I mean, like, come on.
They were taught that in public school, Donnie. Like, not you and me. I was not taught that.
Right. Well, you think about like some of the historic courts, with, you know, the even like some of the very earliest justices, excuse me, who institute these broad overreach between like the Commerce Clause and things like that. And it's, well, you know, the Commerce Clause isn't associated with an R or a D. You know, no one campaigns on that. So therefore, it was sort of this apolitical, hallowed institution. Like, no, that's an ideological position just as much as anything is. And in many ways, much worse than a lot of the ideological decisions that get thrown around. But these people still treat it like this revered institution, and that it's this, you know, this great pillar of our founding that somehow is this moral and virtuous thing, even though all it is just another lever on the controls of power. That's all it is. And people treat it as though it's different, as though this is somehow unheard of. And it just kind of makes me laugh because it's far from unheard of.
Yes. Any more on this one, or do you want to move on?
No, we're good to move on.
Woodrow Wilson. All right. This is our last cringe post of the day. and it's a quote tweet reply to this fella who said, very few Americans are aware of how vile of a man Woodrow Wilson was. His policies set back civil rights in America decades, and he was even more racist than the standards of his time. You can also thank him for the income tax and America becoming world police. Pretty based tweet. A Twitter account called Wilson Haters Posting Their L's, which I thought was a funny joke satire account, but I investigated. It's legit and real. Replied to him and said, Woodrow Wilson had a mature, responsible foreign policy which engendered democracy, independence, and home rule for countries worldwide. Compare that to William Howard Taft's, quote, dollar diplomacy, unquote, and Teddy Roosevelt, who wanted to straight up establish American colonies in Africa. Or, yeah, that's how they straight up establish American colonies in Africa. And then about the income tax, that is just needed to fund a modern functioning government. Opposing it is based off of pure emotion and far-right resistance to taxation, not actual economics. Take that far-right talking point somewhere else. And when I saw this, when I saw this page and I saw this tweet, I immediately thought of Woodrow Wilson's famous quote that he said on his deathbed, verified, specifically about the Federal Reserve Act in his time as president. And he wrote, I am a most unhappy man. I have unwittingly ruined my country. A great industrial nation is controlled by its system of credit. Our system of credit is concentrated. The growth of the nation, therefore, and all of our activities are in the hands of a few men. We have come to be one of the worst ruled, one of the most completely controlled and dominated governments in the civilized world. No longer a government of free opinion. Man, I mean, Woodrow Wilson was based there at the end. I like that he said, I have unwittingly ruined my country. It's like, yes, you did. Yes, you did, Woody. You really did ruin the country. Maybe you could talk about the other stuff because I don't want to take all of it. But he to me is he is the worst president of the 20th century for sure. Maybe only dwarfed by Abraham Lincoln in terms of overall presidents, but yeah. Go for it.
Well, I think that is very telling when people go out to defend a president who's not defending that thing anymore. You know, it's kind of like when people defend Reagan in any capacity, and it's like, dude, even Reagan himself was like, yeah, my biggest regret is that I added $1 billion, you know, a huge amount to the national expenditure and the deficit and stuff. And you know, conservatives tout him as this great conservative hero, ignoring that. And he himself is like, yeah, I kind of regret that, and that sucks. It's like, at the very least, you shouldn't be defending him for these things. So it's really funny when there are these sort of stan accounts who are defending him over the things he's like, no, that was a mistake. I don't like that. And yeah, so like I love the language that this person uses, because we oftentimes mock the ways in which we see the media in particular talking about some of this stuff, like when Donald Trump dropped the bomb for the first time. Well, he'd been droning, but you know, he made the decision publicly to drop the bomb. And everyone's like, wow, he finally feels presidential. And this, you know, this is the first time we've come together. And so you see that strain of language here when he says Wilson had a mature, responsible foreign policy, which is what I love. It's like he's not rootin' and tootin' like Teddy Roosevelt, and he's not as, you know, unreasonable as Taft. He's a mature, responsible foreign policy, which we want democracy and independence and home rule. And you're like, you can't just claim all of these conflicting things. It engendered democracy and independence and home rule, but we had to impose democracy on them. But it was still independent and had home rule. So that's what makes it mature. And you can't like have your cake and eat it too here. That's just a goofy way to think about it. And yeah, and it's like, let's look at the ways that Wilson set up the George W. Bush foreign policy. If you exchanged a Woodrow Wilson speech and a George W. Bush speech, they'd be virtually indistinguishable. All you'd have to do is account for the different ways in which they spoke, but the content of the speeches would be the same. And as much as we've seen, thanks to, I would say, amplified critical media, because he was a Republican, and rightfully so, he was highlighted for terrible things being done. But as much as you can see the destruction that caused, people are somehow oblivious of the ways in which Wilson would promulgate that. I don't think you get much credit. Even if, let's say, Wilson only spoke these ideals and enacted none of them, I still don't think you get credit for saying, hey, we need to do this really bad thing. And then someone else carries it out and you can see the consequence. And it's like, well, at least he didn't do the really bad thing. He just he just supported the idea of doing the really bad thing. It's like, you don't get credit for that. That's still a terrible, awful thing. So I laugh at the language of it being mature, responsible foreign policy. It's like, no, this is just the George W. Bush foreign policy, and It's coming from your favorite guy, so you're defending it, but there's no difference there, and we've seen firsthand in our lifetimes the destruction that caused, let alone what it did back then and the snowball effect that it had.
Yeah, I have this conversation routinely with people about kind of American interventionism around the world, and basically you can kind of debunk all of our interventionism up until about World War II, right? And then people are like, well, I agree with everything, but you have to admit we had to have been involved in World War II. And it's like, no, actually we didn't. And this interventionist policy that we've got started actually before that. The reason we caused World War II to happen inadvertently. And a lot of people don't realize it's like Woodrow Wilson was the reason we started and got involved in World War I, which was a European conflict, which the founding fathers literally said, hey, you probably don't want to get involved or entangled with those folks over there because they fight all the time. And if you get entangled with them, you're going to unbalance, the balance of powers. And a lot of bad things are going to happen. Something kind of like Nazi Germany could happen. But Woodrow Wilson, being an idealist, someone that is like, is a good person and infallible because he has the right opinions and he has the right heart about things. And there's actually also evidence, that he was being pressured by the bankers in the United States who had loaned money to the Allies in the First World War. But basically, we were sending people over to the UK on ships, women and children, citizens. And the reason we got involved in World War I is because even though it was blockaded by the Germans, we sent ships over and they got blown up, and it was called as the Lufthansa Incident. And basically that was the excuse, right? That we were going to go send our troops over there and we were going to be on the side of the good guys. And by us sending our troops over there, we prolonged World War I. We greatly unbalanced the scales of aggression, which made it so that we had the Treaty of Versailles, which basically blamed everything on the Germans, which created the economic environment for Hitler to rise up in. Because if we just let the conflict play out, right, like the European powers would have had to come to an actual fair treaty, right, that would have actually preserved some level of like dignity between the countries and not forced a country into basically back a dog into the corner, and where things and bad people like Hitler could grow and thrive, and so that it's just funny, like his idealism of like we can create and manage the world led to an even more chaotic world only about a decade and a half later. And that's the reason why, Donnie and I hate on him so much, is because his interventionist is the classic example of like, please stop intervening, stop helping, your helping's actually hurting.
That's exactly it. And when people think about geopolitical events and wars and things like that, it's very easy to think about it in black and white terms of these are the good guys and these are the bad guys. And the reality is that a country can enact aggression against another country unnecessarily and immorally and wrongly, and still the people defending aren't necessarily the good guys either. So it's easy to think about, oh well, the side of the UK and France are great and are the correct moral ones because they had a sort of similar ideology to a Western liberal democracy kind of ways of thinking. But you also think, and it's like not that long ago, the UK and France were at war with each other for centuries and centuries. So if you're talking about this new coalition, why all of a sudden if every conflict is full of these good guys and bad guys, how can you have the good guy and the bad guy, whether you think that's France or the UK, on the same team in this one, and then be rooting for that when it has a guaranteed bad guy on there? And then you realize, well, that's because they changed or they evolved or whatever. But you realize more and more that, especially because it's the governments, not even the countries themselves, but it's the people of the countries. It's the governments themselves carrying out all these actions. And it becomes so muddied that oftentimes without this swath of American power going in and like you said, imbalancing things, both sides have to realize we're going to sustain more casualties unless we end this thing, and we have to end this thing in a voluntary way that both sides are going to agree to. Rarely is a massive landslide of power, again, on a side that's not necessarily the good guys versus the bad guys. It's not that simple. And when you had that imbalance of power, then you did come up with the Treaty of Versailles, where it was so overpowered that you end up being able to do an unfair treaty where people are put in this situation that they don't want to be, and you cause resentment. You know, war is awful, and human nature is such that you're going to have these conflicts, and it's terrible. But that doesn't mean that every, treaty at the end of it is a guarantee of peace, all the more. And it doesn't mean that when you come to these terms and you take and take and take with your imperialistic views, like, oh, you owe us all these reparations for the costs that we put in because we came in here. When you have an uneven treaty like that, it really messes things up. And so then you just cause the next chain of events where it's like, well, yeah, maybe we shouldn't have done World War I, but now we have to get involved in World War II because it's in front of us. And it's an endless cycle. And
now
it has not stopped
Iran,
to this day.
and now we need to bomb these people. And what's funny, man, is even World War I, before Woodrow Wilson got involved, was the result of people thinking that they could control everything and make the right type of treaty and the right type of agreement. Because essentially what it boiled down to is everyone in Europe was connected. They had so many alliances and treaties and mutual declarations of war that basically if anyone did anything, all of Europe would be, it would have to go to war against each other. And it boiled down to, the Archduke got shot. One guy got shot. And because one country wouldn't turn the assassins over to another, you had to have millions of people die in a world war because people thought they could control things, right? You had these leaders that were so lofty and idealistic that they formed all these treaties. And lo and behold, the solution to it after the war is over, after millions of bodies were dead, was, let's make another treaty and make more and more. Let's make a League of Nations. Thankfully that failed, but then it gave way to the United Nations. Let's make more treaties and connect more people so that everyone has to force to do one thing or the other. That's going to definitely guarantee peace. It's just, that's the idealism that is so dangerous about these people like Woodrow Wilson, and that's carried on and lived out in the spirit of George W. Bush and basically, everyone that's intervened since then. Is the fact that we can remake the world in our own image or bring democracy to Afghanistan, that has not had democracy for the past 10,000 years. It's like, you think America's powerful enough to do that? It's, get out of here. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah. And I'm, I think for as much as we're sort of pessimistic about how it's led into conflict and well, now that happens, this is kind of like the election propaganda we get. This is the most important election of our lifetimes. We hear every single election.
Yes.
This is the conflict that we have to go into. I think for all of the flaws of mass media through the internet and Twitter and all that, I do think there has been a growing resentment of this idea and a growing skepticism. And I think if this was the year 2005, I think we would be involved in Ukraine, Russia more than we are right now. And we've been involved in ways that the U.S. population hasn't had a voice in the way that we've been giving Ukraine arms and those kinds of things for years. But as far as an actual military involvement, direct conflict, it's been wildly unpopular, even as people support Ukraine and put the little flag in their name. I think it's a much more unpopular position to say that we need to be militarily involved there than any other time in my lifetime. It's been would have been unpopular to say we need to be involved. And that's a good thing because they're trying to sell us this lie just like they tried to sell us every other lie before. And it's not sticking the way that it did in the past.
So to cap that off on that point, the pinned tweet for this Wilson haters posting their L's is Woodrow Wilson would have supported Ukraine. That's the pinned tweet. And you're right. He would have.
Yes, he would have.
He would have gotten the world into a World War III.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, friends, thanks for hanging out with us during the show and going through all these cringe takes with us. If we said anything that you have thoughts on, we'd love to hear from you. You can catch us at Cringe Post Pod on all of our social media or at cringepost.com. And we'll catch you next time.